Welcome back to the channel. This is Trendy Storm and you're watching what if Naruto mastered Forbidden Taijutsu after getting exiled and his chakra sealed. If you enjoy this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Now wasting no more time, let's start the story.
Padding down the dimly lit street was a figure the sidewalk echoed with bare feet. He had little choice but to walk barefoot through the city, which many would consider a bad idea. He didn't really care that his last pair of shoes had worn out almost a month ago. After a year and a half of searching, he finally found a clue to what he was looking for last week. He looked at the tattered piece of paper in his hands and began to scan the area for something. He stopped when he came to a pair of double doors that were easily 6 feet wide and 10 feet high. It wasn't just their peculiarity that made him stop. It was also the atmosphere he was experiencing. The door creaked open as he raised his hand to knock, unsure if it would be heard at all. His eyes grew wide with wonder as he craned his neck. "Whoa." The older man kindly said, "Can I help you, young man?" The man had a terrifying appearance. The man had solid muscle, and he could tell that just by looking at him. Is this Ryo Zanpaka?" The boy was encouraged to go on by the elder, who kept grinning. "It is." "Damn, but this guy was intimidating. I'm looking for someone named Hayato Ferengi." He had yet to give in on anything, though. The elder's eyes briefly flashed. "I'm Hayato, but why are you looking for me?" The younger blonde smiled weakly and shrugged. "I don't really know, sir. My sensei recommended that I look you up." Hayato raised an eyebrow. "I was unaware that many people knew of this address." The boy gritted his teeth and twitched his right eye. "Yeah, I had to find you from rumors and what little information I could get. I've been looking for you for the last year." The giant man praised him, saying, "Oh, you're certainly dedicated, but again I have to ask, why? Tell me, who is your sensei?" The elder's eyebrows shot upwards as he said, "My sensei was Jiraiya." Was this the boy Jiraiya had trained? He moved aside and gestured for him to enter. "Perhaps you should come in," he said. From what little he had seen through the shrubs and fences, the complex resembled a clan compound from Konoha. It appeared somewhat dilapidated, but who was he to speak? It had been a veritable roach motel in his apartment. A dummy dressed like him burning in effigy made him wonder idly if they had already set it on fire. Fun ideas, huh? He followed Hayato to a moderately sized structure at the walkway. They kicked off their shoes and padded to a sliding door. It was pulled aside, revealing a spacious room based on the cushions. "It appears to be a gathering spot." Hayato pushed the boy into the empty room so they could speak privately and said, "Please, come in. Wait here for a moment, would you?" After a few minutes, he heard the door open once more. He was shocked to see him enter with others, though, as he had only anticipated the elder. He glanced at each, beginning to feel a little uncomfortable. There was a man in a formal yukata with dark brown hair, a mustache, and a level gaze. Then there was a man who was much shorter and had a dark hat with a brim that shaded his eyes. The man's smile seemed strangely unsettling to him, if not familiar. A walking wall came next. A man wearing jeans and a beat-up leather jacket, with the sleeves still torn around the edges and rolled up around his biceps. He was reminded of Iruka from his academy days by the scar across his nose. However, that image was totally destroyed by the grumpy aura surrounding him. He had a tank-like build. The next guy wasn't all that great, wearing light sports clothes and a headband over his spiky blue-gray hair. He was incredibly tan. He had the appearance of a true bruiser. The final one was a woman who was, to use a more accurate term, stunning. Her sparse clothing made him think of a vicious jonin. He had encountered a mouse, strangely, rode on her shoulder, but the sword in his hand unnerved him a little even though it was sheathed. The others were seated in rows on either side of Elder Hayato, who occupied the seat in front of him. He repressed the cold he experienced from the attention he was receiving. Though less aggressive, it was comparable to Ki. It was more akin to their presence. He looked up at Hayato and said, "Young man, I'm sorry, but I forgot to ask your name." "Naruto, Sir Naruto Uzumaki." The man with scars laughed. "Fish cake?" The blonde twitched, and the others laughed gratefully. "What of it, boozehound?" The man smelled strongly of alcohol. Even from that distance the man appeared as though he might attempt to pulp him, while the others suppressed giggles. Hayato looked at the teenager while laughing out loud. He obeyed, more than a little perplexed. "Sakari's habits aside, could you please tell the others here what you told me just a little earlier?" "Well, my master spoke of you to me, Hayato-san. He mentioned that I should one day look you up. I'm not too sure why." The mustache-wearing, straight-laced man asked, "Who was your master?" His tone was precise and firm, but not as icy as he had anticipated. Hayato responded, "Jiraiya, the Toad Sage." On his behalf the group's shortest person quivered. "Most of you may not know the name." "I do," exclaimed the short man in green. "He's the famous writer of one of my favorite books." Naruto groaned and palmed his face, even here. The mustached man interrupted, coughing. I've heard a little about him, he's from the elementals. What the crap is that? The elementals, Sakari, the man said. They're an isolated grouping of secret villages where the shinobi lifestyle still flourishes. Sakari, not believing, snorted, you're shitting me. Hayato gave a nod. Akisame is correct, the elementals are isolated geographically and keep themselves well hidden, and while feudal lords may have ordered the shinobi practice to stop, the elemental lands were obscure enough to evade notice, and have continued to operate from the shadows to this very day. Naruto's eyebrows were clearly raised. These were the first people he had met while away who truly knew where he had been raised. And Jiraiya, I haven't seen him in over a decade, he was one of the more honorable of his breed, Hayato said with a smile. He reached into his robe and took out a battered envelope, saying, even though I haven't seen him in a while, he did send me the occasional letter like this one here. I received this letter 3 years ago. Tell me, boy, do you know what it says? With absolutely no clue, Naruto shrugged. Naruto winced as he grinned widely and said, Jiraiya makes reference to a new student, something I thought he would never do again, after the loss of his first. He goes on to say that the boy is fairly hopeless, on Twitch. Has no real talent. Twitch, is a bit of a hothead, and a borderline idiot. By this time, his left eyelid was twitching wildly, and he was thinking about the advantages of Edo Tensei. He could bring his master back to life before severely beating him. Hayato went on, grinning at the young blonde's annoyance. There was much more to the letter than that, though. He goes on to say that he is one of the most stubbornly persistent people he has ever known. There was affection in the words. Despite the initial lighthearted joke at his student's expense, the sage continued by describing the boy's personality. He was stubborn in the sense that he would not give up on anything despite his thick skull. He was said to have a good heart. However, the letter's main point, I would like to put it to a vote, Hayato suggested. Should we train him? Blinking, Naruto said, I'm sorry, what? That was what your master spoke of in his letter, that he might one day bring you here to train. Naruto gasped. He enjoyed working out, of course, but something in the air told him that it was time to run. Before his mat hit the floor again, he was out the door. Sakari gave the others a sly smile. Wow, kid's pretty quick. Kensai laughed. Reminds me of our first disciple. Indeed, though he is faster by far, laughed the well-groomed man. Who shall go fetch him? They said, Apachai will do it, but Shiger was gone. Don't let my feet fail me now. Let's reiterate that he enjoyed training and wasn't a coward. But there was something clearly wrong. His instincts told him that a complete retreat was the best course of action. He had just enough time to jump sideways to avoid the chain that was about to snare his ankle when he heard the distinctive sound of flying metal. He threw the remaining shuriken at his alleged captor while twisting and turning in midair. The metal stars bounced off an expertly used sickle and whizzed through the night. He was taken aback by the woman in front of him once more. He would have loved to go anywhere with this woman if he had been a pervert. She was incredibly attractive, however. He respected women more than his sensei. He had learned from the meeting that she was strong, but he felt uneasy about her movements and the way nothing was wasted. You can fight, she said duskily, giving her approval. Good. He readied himself by removing a kunai from his sleeve. The door opened with a slide. With a casual glance, Hayato raised his impressive golden eyebrows. Oh, Shiger caught our young friend? Of course, she replied in a monotone. Blinking lazily, she pulled the blonde who was bound into the room. The elder asked in jest, how far did he make it? The end of the block, she muttered. Ha! Laughed the short man with the mustache. That means I get your dessert tomorrow, Sakari? Bellowed the gruff-looking man in protest. In terms of clothing, the mistress of weapons had seen better days. The adolescent carried numerous concealed weapons. She estimated that he was running out, though not as many as she. Nevertheless, this resulted in multiple slashes through her yukata, which was smaller than advised. He was above average with a blade, but she had been forgiving and he hadn't drawn blood. Now, young man, please tell me, why did you run? The teenager pouted and gave a slight glare. Survival instinct, he complained at that. A number of masters burst out laughing. Tell me, then, do you really not want to join us here at Ryozanpaka? To study with 6 masters is quite the honor? His blue eyes grew wide, but he kept most of his astonishment to himself. They were all masters, so he had been correct. Really, it would be an honor. She sighed in defeat. But, something about this place scares the hell out of me, was his direct response. Ah, a natural reaction, the man in the yukata replied. Do you not wish to become stronger, young man? To gain power without reason is meaningless. Very wise, the man in the yukata replied, nodding gravely. But do you not have a reason? Not at the moment, was the blonde's boring response. Still, I'm not an idiot. I know that I can't just shut people out. Sooner or later, I'll come across people that I'll want to protect. I want to continue my training so that when the time comes I won't be useless or too weak. I'm not Superman, so I can't say anything big like I'll protect everyone on Earth. I'm not a modest guy who will say it's enough if I can protect as many people as my two hands can handle. Either I want to protect a mountain load of people, and to do that I need to get stronger. Looking at some of the others, the older man grinned. The elder cut in, smiling and clearly not understanding what the younger blonde was saying. Then you can train with us until then, and then decide your course, he said. Naruto jerked. Was there ever a choice for him? He was starting to ponder. He slouched slightly, resigned. Now that we have that all settled, Naruto said with a snort, perhaps you could tell us just how you made it out of the elemental countries. I went there long ago, and getting in was almost as difficult as getting out. The blonde's face twisted, as though she was struggling with herself. I'll need you to let me go. First, he nearly missed the movement because the chain was gone so quickly. He lifted his right hand and unrolled the bandages until the strips of cloth gathered in his lap. He had a strange pair of dark rings on his appendage, one on each of his middle and index fingers. His response was bitter. Long and short of it, I was exiled from my village, he said. The gathered masters listened in silence as he said, they slapped these on me to seal my chakra, and I was publicly booted. As far as getting past the borders, it was fairly easy. I've been going places I shouldn't since I first started to crawl, but, for the short version, I walked a lot. A fascinating story, I'm sure, the older person interrupted, but I think our new student. Naruto let out a grumpy groan, would like to get some sleep after his long travels. Sunday morning the following day. Kenichi appeared to be warmed over as he shuffled into the dining area. He groaned, I don't know if I can do this. Why'd I have to train so early in the morning? Every morning, from the moment the sun first appeared until school began, as well as into the night and after school, he was subjected to that by Akisame-sensei. However, it was much worse because it was the weekend. 16 to 20 hours of unbearably agonizing pain, and the weekend session was just getting started. It could be worse. Kenichi's tears flowed freely. The sad thing is, you're probably right. Hold on. He turned around. Blinking, a teenager his own age was sipping his tea calmly. On the other side of him, the blonde with the spiky hair, dressed in a basic karate gi, didn't appear nearly as alarmed as he did. With a startled blink, Kenichi said, Ah, who are you? What are you doing here? Drinking tea? The blonde asked jokingly, displaying bewildered innocence at the inquiry, as she lowered the cup. The dry sarcasm made Kenichi twitch. Yeah, I can see that. With only a little less caution, he said, Who are you? Akisame declared, he's your fellow disciple, as she entered the room. Kenichi stumbled, startled. What? There was another apprentice, even though he had only recently joined the dojo. His sensei asked the elder to aid in his training some time ago, Akisame clarified, and, as your masters, we agreed that you could use a training partner. When Kenichi stopped gaping long enough to think, he was unable to argue with the reasoning behind that. It was one thing to learn forms and exercises, but he had little opportunity to practice against an opponent outside of sporadic thugs surprise fights. Mew did, however, spar with him occasionally. It only made him think of what Akisame had told him. Sparring was a great way to learn, but it was also very risky. The blonde smiled naively, or unknowingly, and held out his hand. Naruto. Outside. The strange teenager was across from Kenichi. Akisame said, Now, then, I want you two to spar. It will give us an idea of your improvement, Kenichi, and as a test of your skill, Naruto, while sitting with a number of the other masters on the porch. I don't know much about this guy. Kenichi thought he really didn't want to fight, but if Akisame and the others thought he was okay, it wouldn't be all that different from fighting someone like Mew. So, I've got to start off strong. The blonde wouldn't be explicitly attempting to hurt him, that is, it was merely a friendly altercation. Not that his knees weren't a little shaky. He was not a big fan of fighting. Are you ready? Yeah, yes, sensei? Akisame's gaze flickered. All right, begin? What happened next was interesting. Kenichi made excellent use of his limited abilities, seizing the blonde's opportunities when they arose. However, the blonde's responses to those moves were not what was anticipated. To put it briefly, his fighting abilities were essentially those of a brawler. He appeared to know very little about these forms, and his form was poor. Kenichi readily took his attacks and turned them against him, even though they had only taught him a small number of moves thus far. Despite this alleged weakness and the quantity of blows he received, Kenichi was never able to defeat him. The blonde was gradually wearing him down with his own amazing endurance and sporadic hits, even though Kenichi was making progress. Mew joined them with tea as the two young students talked while they recovered from the spar. The blonde concluded that he would undoubtedly be consuming a lot of it in the days ahead. Akisame watched them engage while sitting on the wooden walkway, considering what he had witnessed under his scrutiny. Kenichi had indeed improved and was now simpler to evaluate. Afterward, there was Naruto. Sadly, the boy was a complete mess. His movements were clumsy and crude, as if he knew nothing about any martial arts styles. On the other hand, despite his lack of overt skills, he had extraordinary instincts and incredible stamina and endurance. Seeing him take all those blows in order to land one of his own had been quite the spectacle. It required a high pain threshold and patience. With a low voice, he said, "So, what do you think?" Calmly, the elder sipped his tea. "Despite the life he has lived, I believe this one can be saved." Sakari asked over his beer, "They're all mercenary types then?" The elder gave a nod. "Most, though I've met a few that were different from what I've read and seen just now. Naruto was cut from a different cloth." "Then why's he so sloppy?" Akisame concluded, his voice laced with disappointment. "He lacked the proper training," the elder said. Jiraiya's letter spoke of his training with him consisting primarily of teaching him patience and thinking things through. Tactics, areas he was supposedly quite poor in, but that before that he'd never truly received the proper instruction. "His fighting instincts are top-notch though," Akisame mentioned. "Yeah, saw that," Sakari sneered. "Kid skills may stink, but he must have been in a lot of fights to develop those kinda reactions." Shiger added, "He sleeps with a weapon," in a tone of approval. "While not unusual for his people, I think it to be more of a defensive habit." Akisame thought the jujutsu master turned to the elder for any indication of confirmation. "His movements, the way he checks his food, I've been wondering if it is not so much due to training as it is from abuse." The elder explained, "The most Jiraiya mentioned was that he had a challenging life. But that is neither here nor there. The question is, what do you think, masters of Ryozanpaka?" "He has potential," Kensai admitted, to Sakari's grunt of agreement and Apichai's infrequent but solemn nod. "He fights well." The typically reserved weapons master gave him high marks. Akisame nodded, and the elder lowered his head. "Then let us train this young man." Even though they were unaware of it, those who knew vowed not to let the darkness win this one. Naruto shivered for no apparent reason. This great opportunity had come with one caveat. High school, the blonde's only thought, as he fiddled with his button-down shirt, was a multiple homicide. Even so, he continued to chuckle whenever he remembered the recent encounter between Kenichi and the masters. He had apparently been training with the masters on a part-time basis. Not anymore. They had pulled him aside and offered him a full-time teaching position. For a civilian, he ran fairly quickly, but not quickly enough. He remembered at least escaping the compound before being apprehended, and he did so with some pride. He found the principal to be somewhat annoying, particularly during the half-hour audit when he was asked about his background and future goals. Fortunately, it wasn't too hard because of the fake documents that his masters had given him. In addition, he was quite adept at fabricating believable lies on the fly in response to any unexpected inquiries. Even so, I found the guy to be rather annoying. She gestured to the door and said, "Class, we have a new student today." Following his lead, Naruto entered and approached the instructor. He found her strangely utilitarian and strict. He felt uncomfortable and out of place as he stood in front of his peers' different lives. Same age, they appeared incredibly soft. Had he ever been so naive? He had witnessed suffering, death, and adversity long ago. A part of him wished he could have had their sheltered lifestyle. On the other hand, everything he had gone through, both the good and the bad, had shaped who he was today. She suggested, "Why don't you tell us all a little about yourself?" He said, well, the name's Naruto Uzumaki." While scratching the back of his head with one hand in a pocket, he concluded with a crooked smile, "I just moved here and really, there's not much else to tell." Startled, Kenichi asked, "Wait, you're in the class ahead of me?" "I'm older than you," Naruto answered. "In more ways than one, more experienced, older, and occasionally possessing the memories of a demon that dates back hundreds of years." Yes, he was a friend of complicated. "And what are you complaining about? I've got all this extra stuff to read just to understand what I'm currently taking." He sighed. His wicked learning curve and unusually low need for sleep were his only redeeming factors. Some topics he was already familiar with. The current lessons were merely reminders of the subjects he had to learn in the academy, such as physics, chemistry, and biology, which were all meant to make them better little killers. He struggled most in classes like math, literature, and history for apparent reasons. There was cultural isolation in the villages. He used guesswork and estimation to complete his math literature. Well, that wasn't too horrible. His time with Jiraiya had given him some experience. He had contributed to the lecture's final draft. Jiraiya wrote the softer parts and the sex scenes, relationship development and plot development. When Jiraiya first asked him to write some, he reviewed it and then gave him a strange smile. Pretty sappy, he had shot back. At first, he had attempted to beat the living daylights out of him for that comment. He hadn't thought of it. The pervert had threatened to deny him his weekly allotment of ramen unless he wrote. To be honest, he hadn't thought it was all that horrible. He and his fellow disciple had to work out every morning before running laps while pulling weighted objects behind them, while Kenichi received a similar tire, but with their sensei added. Akisame had rigged his with a few eerie stone statues. Ah! Not the whip. Not the whip. Not the whip, broke Kenichi's eyes. Then run faster. You're still too slow, turtles run faster. Naruto laughed just ahead of them. Kenichi angrily protested, why aren't you whipping him? Akisame blinked from his perch, his hair blowing in the wind. Kenichi whimpered, I think that was obvious. It's because I'm whipping you. Because I don't need motivation, Kenichi, Naruto chuckled out loud, and because I'm smart enough to keep my butt moving away from the man with the whip. He laughed. Akisame chastised him with a single snap, simultaneously revealing the actual length of the whip. Naruto recalled to keep as far ahead as he could after hearing the words, less talking. If you've got the breath to poke fun at your fellow disciple, then you should use that breath to run faster. Then Kenichi was abandoned and left to the wolves. Afterwards, phew, Naruto sighed, leaning against the dojo's outside wall off to the side. Kenichi was sobbing anime-style tears over his suffering. That was a good run. He's just as nuts as they are, whimpered the poor boy in his mind. With Gaki-like eyes, Kenichi glared, oh, come on, Kenichi, it's not that bad. He yelled, how would you know? Naruto responded with a toothy smile, my old sensei? He took me to an onsen in a village of people who practiced martial arts. He was scratching his chin. First, I thought it was to do his research. The perv, and then I thought just maybe he was being kind and giving me the chance to relax. Regarding the direction of this, Kenichi had the haziest of impressions. What happened? Kenichi's eyebrows twitched as she said, he threw me into the women's side naked. Her face was a mix of jealousy and horror. Naruto gave a snort. You think this morning was rough? Try spending an entire day outrunning a dozen pissed-off women all bearing weapons, and the urge to smite. The two boys sighed, accepting that neither would have a normal teacher. Why are all the best senseis crazy? They asked. Hurry up you two, called Mew from across the training yard, or we'll be late for school. Afterwards at school. Being back in a place of learning, first the academy, then this school, was somewhat nostalgic, and by nostalgic, he meant extremely annoying. However, he was forced to accept the monotony and grit his teeth due to his agreement with the elder and the other masters. This was an uncontrollable reaction. However, he was quite content with that after everything that had happened to him over the past few years, including everything that had happened in the last year. After classes ended, the remainder of the day was devoted to training and any assigned homework. Luckily, Naruto had picked up the ability to read anything and everything during his free time that took away from his regular study schedule at Ryozanpaka. He still had homework, but by the time classes ended, it had significantly decreased. And after he returned, he was terrified of Akisame's training. It made little sense and was strange. At least he had learned something from him. He was physically more advanced than Kenichi, despite the fact that he lagged behind him in learning forms and kata. That didn't stop their sensei from beginning his muscle building program from the beginning, just as he had done with Kenichi. Additionally, he only engaged in the endurance training half the time. Even though he did participate in the runs, Akisame and the elder had decided that they would beat kata into him for half of that time, given his already exceptional endurance and stamina. As a test of progress, they would occasionally be pitted against each other, but most of the time they would spar, very lightly, with the masters. The daily sparring exercises under the masters were nearly incapacitating. They were just so strong that their blows were tremendously powerful even when they held back. Luckily, both boys could withstand a good beating. Akisame randomly struck the two teenagers with a cane rod as he watched them perform difficult one-armed push-ups on the poles on their second arms. They were both in their high 50s, but they differed greatly from one another because of the starting from scratch strategy. Naruto's strength was somewhat inferior to Kenichi's. Together with the elder, he had decided that the easiest way to get him ready for the training was to dismantle and rebuild him. But right now, the blonde's endurance was proving itself once more, even though Kenichi was making more progress while his fellow disciple was exhibiting only mild strain. Kenichi was trembling from exhaustion, groaning, and perspiring heavily, but he had taken that into account. Their fundamental goal was to continue until they were unable to do so. When the blonde was too slow to react, the willowy rod swung down hard on his hand with a lightspeed swish. 81, 82, 83. At this point, Kenichi was on the verge of falling out, and even Naruto was displaying a respectable amount of strain, with beads of sweat on his brow as he appeared to push his arm out. Their chief sensei dropped his cane. He said, "All right, that's enough for now," and got to his feet. Kenichi's arm froze and he collapsed to the ground, chin first. "Oh, thank good," groaned the brunette. "What say we go for a run before dinner?" Akisame proposed. Stroking his neatly trimmed mustache, Kenichi stood while crying, "Naruto, you'll stay here and work on your Muay Thai with Apachai." Kenichi, the tire. He might have objected at any other time, but given who the blonde would be training with, it was plausible that he was receiving an easy task just before his agonizing run. Alongside Apachai. With excitement, the tanned giant bucked his gloves together after saying, "Papa, okay then. Time for Apachai to teach again." He was given instructions on the fundamental moves he could use for the next hour. To be exact, it only took 10 to 20 minutes for the remaining 40 or so. They had to endure Apachai's almost fatal, easy, punches and kicks. He was able to bounce back from setbacks that had made him famous, but wow, he thought his head would fly off his shoulders half the time. It turned out that his instincts, which he never faltered on, had been spot on that first day. These people frightened him, but he had nothing against becoming stronger, even though he knew it came at a cost of blood, sweat, and suffering. It felt like daily exposure to Tsunade's superpowered, lazy hits. He flew backward, colliding with the outer wall, as a rock-like knee buried itself in his cheek. It makes sense why his gut had told him to run like a bitch. After dinner, the Ryozanpaka students, seated at the long table, defended their food. Even so, Naruto was succeeding much more in front of Kensai's hand. A kunai materialized and embedded itself in the table years ago. Jiraiya had instilled in him the game of, "No touchy my food," and he was determined not to simply allow them to take his food. "Naruto!" yelled Mew. No kunai at the table. Shigure discreetly concealed the weapon she had been tinkering with to the side, projecting an air of casualness. "Let the boys eat," reprimanded Hayato sarcastically. "They'll need the energy for tomorrow's training." The blonde with the spiky hair leaned over and muttered something to his comrade in arms, as was now his usual response. Kenichi whimpered, "How many laps?" The shrimpy brunette then posed his own query. Naruto moaned, "How was training with Apachai?" Even though his ribs were healing quickly, they continued to hurt like nothing else. He just made it out the door after leaving the dining area when Shigure crept up directly behind him. Even by ninja standards, she was silent. There was a minute of silence as she walked him to the master's quarters, tapping him on the shoulder and saying, "Come with me, Naruto." The elder, the other masters, and Mew resided in the main house lately. He and Kenichi had been confined to the students' dorm. He followed. Bewildered, she stopped in front of two sliding doors and turned to face him, her expression as unreadable as ever. After years in the academy and additional time spent with Jiraiya, he was still unable to read her after a week and some changes. "This is my room," she said humbly. The words, "I invite you in," were used to usher him in. He paused at the threshold, aware of the traps. Dumbfounded by the unexpected invitation, she turned back to her and nodded slowly and curtly for him to continue. He moved forward because he trusted her, but he did his best to stay out of the traps. Like the other masters, Shigure observed his deep awareness of his surroundings. Once more she was in favor of it. His movements showed subtle twitches and hidden caution. Although they are frequently regarded as paranoid, a healthy dose of them typically kept a person alive. Like the majority of the compound, the room had strong elements of older Japanese design. There was a 4 by 5 meter wooden floor right inside the door. As he entered, the floor ended just over a meter to his right and descended onto a stone floor. There was an unexpected workspace in that depression with all the equipment she would need to keep her weapons in good working order or even fix them if necessary. A pair of complete samurai armor in excellent condition was among the many weapons of various designs that were displayed openly in multiple locations, despite the walls having a number of shelves that resembled cupboards. He might not know how to use the weapons, but he was able to identify a few of them: shuriken of all shapes and sizes, tanto, ninjutsu, katana, and a plethora of other weapons he was ignorant of. He surmised that she used the chips in the rafters and walls as targets when she felt like it. That fact was already sold by the few kunai that were still embedded in those surfaces. She swayed past his hesitant stance and slid the door shut behind her. "Sit, please," indicating a mat since his sensei had invited him in. He eased himself down into a loose cross-legged position instead of dropping onto the mat, as he was informally inclined to do. Even though he was aware that Shigure was one of the less formal senseis, he still felt the need to be respectful. They had treated him well, to be honest. They frightened him to no end, but it was for his benefit. Consequently, he would respect their investment only a bit. She sagged onto the mat across from him, though, as he had more or less anticipated. She sat with her right leg up and bent at the knee and her left leg curled under her, resting on her left hip. Even though her kimono was incredibly small, it was still able to conceal anything more intriguing than her pronounced curves. She didn't really care about what other people thought. To her, it was just what was comfortable to others. It might be seen as a rather provocative stance, and long ago, after he had overcome his ignorance, he had realized how important it was to avoid staring. Tahamaru, her tiny mouse, descended from the rafters and landed on her head. Shiger didn't typically eat meals with the masters, as he had quickly discovered the mouse must have come from where she and it had been eating, he surmised. She said in her dark voice, "I wanted to talk with you about your training," before focusing entirely on him. "If you agree, you will start lessons under me." He sat there dumbfounded, completely stunned. "You do not wish for me to teach you?" she asked, managing a complete sentence without pausing, a single eyebrow arching. "No, I mean yes," he stammered. "I mean, that'd be great, Shiger-sensei." He suppressed the twitch and said, "Good, though I was going to teach you." Regardless, when it came to the decisions made by their students, the masters were blasé whether they wanted to learn or not, they were going to be taught. "I know you have kunai. What weapons do you use?" His brow furrowed slightly as he considered that he didn't pretend to be an expert on weapons. "Well, I'd say I'm okay with kunai," he said, shrugging. Iruka and the Academy's training had been little more than an introduction to the fundamental ninja weapons, such as shuriken and kunai. "I can use shuriken and wire, but I've never really had any teachers who've been heavy into weapons before." Outside of the Academy, Jonin-sensei, extracurricular studies, or family teachings provided more sophisticated weapons and methods. He may not have learned much from Kakashi, but it had not been primarily about weapons. Jiraiya had attempted to instill in him the importance of using every tool at his disposal. Fukasaku actually only had time to teach him Kaza-kumite, frog style, and the sage techniques likewise. B persisted in teaching him how to deal with kyubi. In actuality, he had never had a teacher who encouraged the use of weapons. "It's a start," Shiger said with a falsely indifferent sigh. "Tomorrow, we will begin your weapons training." The morning after, Kenichi sighed and handed the bills over. "Here's this month's due," he said. He paid to be repeatedly assaulted on a monthly basis. It nearly brought him to tears. The Kenpo master grinned and shuffled the paper money neatly, counting them in private. Observing all of this, he felt it only right to contribute as well. When he got to his master and fellow disciple, he reached into his pocket and took out his wallet. Even though the elder had not mentioned charging the blonde teen, he was hoping to squeeze out a little extra cash, so he said, "Ah, Naruto, I've been meaning to broach the subject of dojo tuition with you." Naruto placed Kenichi's installment on a small pile of cash. He had observed Kenichi's drop from a distance and had matched it. "I can cover my end," he said in a straightforward manner. "Remember, you never paid your entry fee, and with a penalty tax, your current payment is double," Kensai said despite his groan. Naruto took out several more pieces of paper. "Hey, where'd you get that?" Kenichi curiously inquired. He had quickly realized that Naruto had no family. That left the issue of how he was paying for his education, and now this from the substantial pile of bills. "It is unlikely that you get a job or something." That easily doubled the amount he was required to pay. Perhaps Ma-sensei had become more adept at negotiating the dojo's fee than he had with him. Naruto shrugged and said, "Wrote a book," trying not to draw attention to it. Kenichi's eyes were irritated. What? There was absolutely no way someone who was hardly older than him had written a book, and based on how effortlessly he threw down the cash, it had been a success. Naruto gave a shrug. "My sensei was a successful author. I helped him with his last book." Kensai had a twinkle in his eyes. "Yes," he said, grinning a little. "Jiraiya's books have always been an inspiration to me." Kensai's hands were clenched, the paper crumpling in his grip as he counted the bills spread out in front of him. He scratched his nose at the teen's wide-eyed expression and said, "I'm even thinking about continuing the series." He had observed the minor alterations in Jiraiya's writings, which were not detrimental but did not lessen the book's appeal. The well-known pervert did everything in his power to keep from publicly pleading with the boy to do so. Suspicious of the light in his sensei's eyes, Kenichi questioned, "What kind of books?" Kensai's chest swelled as she took the initiative to respond, "Books to inspire the..." Naruto said, "Dirty romance novels." In closing, Kensai's confidence was shattered. Kenichi's left eye twitched as he said, "Though I got him to tone it down in the last one." Kensai would undoubtedly be a fan of these books. "Though I'd like to point out that with the switch from hardcore porn to romance with the occasional sex scene, sales doubled," he said with pride. That was what he had done. "So you're really loaded?" With a wise lecture, "Money's not everything, Kenichi." He gave his fellow disciple a childlike pat on the head. "All right. So perhaps he had a good life. He had signed Jiraiya on as a joint account holder after they had colluded on the most recent book, making him his business partner. He hadn't touched the money until now, but Tsunade had pulled him aside and told him that Jiraiya would have preferred it that way. There was still a part of him that believed the money belonged to Jiraiya and him alone. She had even attempted to persuade him to give her a loan at that point, something about a diplomatic mission to the elemental nation's capital of gambling. Yes, he would purchase that one. However, Jiraiya had taught him the importance of necessity. As long as he could live with his choice, he had to do what was necessary to survive. The old woman would constantly lecture him, telling him not to be foolish. Furthermore, based on his knowledge, Jiraiya would view his failure to use the money for survival as foolish. In addition, he had discovered that it was much harder to rob ATMs in a large city. In spite of his need, the elder had given him a severe talking to. Can you guess which one he decided on? Hint. When the elder felt like it, he was incredibly frightening. Looking across the table at his perverted sensei, as was always the case, Kensai said, I could probably use someone to go over the rough manuscript. He appeared to be about to cry with joy. Don't do that. The mustached Chinaman's cheeks were wet with tears. Instruction. Kenichi left with Apachai, which quickly turned into one-on-one lessons with the Muay Thai expert. Both Kensai and Akisame had decided that keeping one student conscious while the other recovered was more practical. He would thus instruct each of them individually in Muay Thai. He ignored his fellow disciples' cries of, "Save me," and returned his focus to Shigur as she demonstrated the more esoteric applications of small arms. She was currently demonstrating to him how to operate the chain sickle. It was heart-stopping how she began the session. He had been sitting beneath the tree in a moment of freedom after finishing with Akisame when he heard the sound of metal before being chained to the tree, but the end was still flying. Unadulterated horror was reflected in his blue eyes as the attached sickle flashed into view and approached, sinking into the tree just short of his face. Luckily, he was adept at recovering. Tsunade had described him as stubbornly resilient. In any case, it served as a brief reminder of 2 points. First of all, he had been irresponsible in letting his guard down here. Secondly, Shigur had informed him that she would begin his lessons today. Your form is still rigid, she reprimanded. Holding her own weapon in her belt, she approached him from behind and adjusted his grip for him. She firmly grasped his arms and encouraged him to slowly twist the chain, saying, "It's not just from the elbow you need to feel the flow of the weapon. Feel it as it swings. The chain is an extension of yourself. Reach out with it." Well, he was a complete moron when it came to girls, mostly because he had been so underexposed to them for so long. But he found her intimacy challenging. In addition to the fact that he liked the masters, he could see that she was attractive in his opinion. They were all decent people. Not that his heart wasn't pounding when he felt her pressing against his back. She was actually an inch shorter than him, so she wasn't very tall either. You would think that spending 3 years with Jiraiya would have corrupted his innocence and tarnished him. No luck at all, but he made himself stay on course and do as she said, no matter how intimidating her soft, whispered commands were to him. He snapped out with the chain after twisting it while maintaining a loose grip in her guidance. The weighted end shot forward, encircling the selected post with a swing before tangling with itself and rapping violently against the painted target. Good. He undid the locked chain as they walked to the post. She reiterated, the chain is meant to bind, making it easier to get to your opponent. As they retreated, she took off hers and began swinging it in a tight circle. The chain in her hand began to sing and then shot forward, saying, "But that is not its only use," before socking the top of the post with a sickening thunk and embedding itself in it. The weight shot straight at the post. The weight came flying back to her as she jerked on the line, and she pulled it out of the air as effortlessly as if it had been thrown. She continued by showcasing some of the more difficult techniques, regulating the chain's trajectory while it is in flight. Getting the sickle end to embed precisely where you want it to requires flinging it in a manner similar to that of the weight, utilizing the chain to block, divert, and lock opponent attacks, and those were the only ones she thought he was competent enough to understand. Overall, he came out of the lesson much less hurt than he had anticipated. The sickle in the face incident confirmed his suspicion that she had sliced him to pieces. He was free of all the expected cuts and slashes. He had gone to the only people he truly knew at the school during the lunch break. Even though he managed to locate them, they were well concealed, though it was also possible that he had snuck in on their lunch. Kenichi had nearly passed out from fear of being discovered. He watched his fellow disciple hyperventilate and said, "You need to relax, Kenichi," trying not to smile. "Easy for you to say," the brunette shot back. "You don't have people trying to fight you everywhere you go." He suggested in a feeble way, "At least you're getting in some extra running." Without further introduction, Kenichi pouted sullenly and bit into his sandwich. Oh, haha. He was usually pursued until he gave up and engaged in combat. Hunting season was still open on his scrawny butt because, surprisingly, They had done nothing to quell rumors of his defeat at the hands of Suji, not even after the first week. Mew tried to console him with a smile and a cute furrowed brow. At least no one will find us in here. She turned to face Naruto, who gave her a shrugging nod, indicating that he had found their hidden dining area discreetly. Yeah, all the people that want to kick your butt are still wandering around the school. Kenichi was shaking. Kenichi rocked back and forth on the mat, looking pathetic. Hell, I passed a bunch of seniors who were looking for you not 10 minutes ago. Naruto, that's not helping, Mew said in a whisper. The poor boy had begun to twitch violently during his brief conversation, overcome by a sense of depression about his impending fate outside. He drank some of his tea and sat with them in silence, laughing uneasily and saying, sorry. The first disciple got his butt handed to him in a street fight not even a day after arriving and meeting Kenichi. Everyone else wanted a piece now. The former shinobi appeared contemplative as he sipped his tea. Look at the bright side, he complained. Faye, what bright side, after school's over? Yeah? Brown eyes look up hopefully. Kenichi fell face first onto the mat they were sitting on and then curled into a fetal position, saying, you get to leave. And get driven into the ground at the dojo. My life scary, my life scary, my life scary. Naruto, Mew exclaimed, brandishing a rice ball as a warning. He threw up his hands, embarrassed but unable to contain his smile. I'm sorry, I couldn't help it. Ah, here you are. Kenichi's all-encompassing self-pity vanished as soon as he recognized the voice's annoying, high-pitched whine. Nijima, great, like my day wasn't bad enough. The Weasley teenager said, oh, that hurts, Kenichi, and recoiled in pretended pain. He leaned over to Mew while quietly drinking his tea and observing their interactions. Who's this? He asked, his face practically shouting. Weirdo. Well, that an creep, but who was he to judge? Perhaps his first instincts were wrong. Not very likely. The seedy teenager saw that there were more people in the group and accepted Mew's politely offered cup of tea. Oh, expanding your inner circle. Kenichi? Golden eyebrows twitched. Whoa, that look did not sit well with him. He took out his PDA, retrieved his profile, and compared the face to the student roster. Naruto Uzumaki asked, making friends with upperclassmen. Kenichi? Sophomore transfer pupil. Strangely, he had no information before starting school, no prior address, school, or anything else really. He was only accepted because of a placement test, but that didn't tell him anything. He would never be satisfied with incomplete files. The greasy teenager crooned, Haruo Nijima, and held out his hand. The limb was offered, and he reluctantly shook it. He had the impression of shaking hands with the devil, or something similar strange. Naruto Uzumaki. Oh, I know who you are, Nijima said with a cluck. I suppose Kenichi hasn't mentioned me. I make it my business to know everything about everyone. You're kinda weird. Never let it be said that he liked to sugarcoat his remarks, despite the almost sinister undertone and the fact that I didn't feel threatened by him. Leaving the school for the day. You know the nuttiest people. Kenichi gave him a sullen glare in return. Maybe, but you know them too. The blonde stopped walking and scratched at his cheek while reflecting, I guess you're right. Nijima grinned gloomily as she leaned against the wall of the street they had just crossed. This was a fresh addition to the board, but he might be able to use it in a similar way to Kenichi. His sixth sense was piqued by his familiarity with Kenichi and Mew as well as the extremely hazy information about him. This was not the first time he had so little knowledge about a person. Although Mew's file did have previous scholastic history, it was actually very similar. He was aware that something was happening. He closed the lid on his PDA and began to walk while grinning evilly. It was not true to say that Shiger had given up on Kenichi. In actuality, she would only teach him how to defend against weapons because Kenichi disliked them and had no intention of using them, typically leaving him physically and psychologically scarred in the process. Minimal application of her abilities. Conversely, Naruto had no such guilt. The weapons master was pleased she could really teach this student. She stated, your stance, it needs to be strong, but flexible. Akisame had persuaded Shiger that, although swordplay was still possible, she should use wooden swords for instruction. That he had recently carved. In fact, did the guy sleep at all, really? Shiger stood poised with her own wooden katana in hand across from him, her beatific features displaying the same drowsy expression. She was also examining him at the same time. He was already giving information before she had even taught him any of the planned exercises. For someone who had never trained with a sword, his sloppy stance was understandable but flexible. He held the wooden hilt tightly but loosely. He was clearly drawing on his hand-to-hand kunai combat experience. A beginning, but she would teach him the right way. Even with everything she saw, she had more to assess. She guided him in a slow lunge, lowering her raised bakken in a single, fluid motion. Your attacks need to flow. She gestured for him to keep imitating her motions. If you hesitate, your strikes lose power. You will practice these motions until you know them by heart, she said, crossing her arms beneath her large chest, after performing a number of katas. And then, you will combine them. She moved up beside him and corrected his grip by moving his hands in a barely noticeable but noticeable way, still cradling her sword in her hands. Strength will come later. It isn't always the stronger swordsman that wins. Skill, agility, finesse are all important. You must be able to make all your attacks into one continuous dance. As he listened to his senseis talk passionately about their area of expertise, he had to admit that he occasionally admired the master's. Jiraiya had been no different. Putting aside his big, perverted game, he had witnessed the greatness of his teacher as a man. THWK. Stay focused. He shook his head and uncrossed his eyes, dispelling the stars. She had gently struck him upside the head with her wooden sword as his focus wavered. It meant a lump to him, but it was gentle for her. She surprised him by reaching up and patting him on the head, saying, "Sorry, master. Train now, think later," said the voice, which was always dark. His sensei was a woman with few words. After an hour, Sakari and Kenichi had a joint training session. Kenichi appeared undamaged. That was a miracle, given that he had been training with Apachai for less than an hour. "All right. You two get to punching," she said, pointing to the rope-bound planted logs. "I want you to keep good form." Both of them echoed, "Yes, Master Sakari." Although Naruto's was not as forceful. Unlike Kenichi, he wasn't prepared to boldly tell his teachers everything. After finishing his beer, he crushed the can and threw it carelessly onto the porch surrounding the closest building to be disposed of later. He stood by his own post and inhaled. "All right now, I want 100 punches from each of you." "Well, that's not so bad," Kenichi said in a disdainful whisper to nobody. Sakari, however, managed to catch it. "That's just to get you warmed up, Kenichi," he said, grinning viciously, incredibly vicious. After 30 minutes, the two were witnessing their karate sensei teach them a new move. Sakari said, "It's called the Miyatad," while simultaneously striking both fists. Kenichi's excitement for picking up a new skill from the karate master that day vanished at that moment. The married couple's hand? Seriously? That was a cliched name, not to pass judgment. Rolling his eyes at the younger teen, Naruto recalled a time when he had behaved similarly toward Jiraiya. He had once said, "Teach me something awesome, pervy sage," as an example. Being outside of that argument was really strange. A little humility, too. Kenichi's lackluster attitude toward the day's lesson under the karate master did not stop the karate enthusiast from carrying on with his instruction. However, he initially cuffed the brat upside the head in response to Kenichi's lackluster reaction to his day's technique selection. Naturally, easily, still meant that the brunette fell into the ground face first. Yes, he also recalled those moments. He had quickly learned to stay away from those whenever possible. The words, "Stop Erwinin, brat," were uttered roughly by Sakari. "You don't see your fellow disciple bitching? Like I can't figure out whining makes things worse?" he asked, shaking his head at Kenichi as he pulled himself dizzily back up to his feet. Kenichi gave him the best glare he could, even though 3 of the blondes were bobbing in his line of sight. Sakari crossed his arms once more and gave a wise nod. "You hear that, Kenichi? Your fellow disciple says to man up." "I didn't say that," Naruto moaned in his head, aware that he should not have spoken. He received a smack on the head for saying, "Don't put words in my mouth, Boozhound sensei." However, he was able to catch himself before he fell, only stumbling in place. Worth it. Sakari disregarded all of Kenichi's murmurs. He refused to let his watch slack off. He hammered the lesson home, but it would take some time before Kenichi would fully understand the move. "Yeah, whatever, get your butts in gear. I want you to go through the motions 200 times against the post, and then you'll have a short spar to test it out. Come on, Naruto. Punch. You can do it," Apachai exclaimed, guiding the blonde in a mild, by his standards, spar as Kenichi stood by. Twitching next up for him would be the Muay Thai giant. Before the actual thing, this was like a prelude, a nightmare. "Now, you dodge, HWAP. Kenichi instinctively winced. That time, the blonde ate a knee to the chest. For a brief moment, Naruto felt himself lifted out of the grip of gravity before collapsing back to the ground and lowering himself to his knees, coughing and wheezing, crying and having his eyes water. "Noohoho." Apachai started crying right away. "Apachai did it again," he exclaimed, looking down at Naruto with his gloved fists amusingly perched atop his head. "Don't die on Apachai, Naruto." Kenichi was shocked when the blonde's trembling hand appeared a moment later, dispelling the giant's anxieties and forcing a smile despite the agony. "Sokai. He rasped, coughing, "Just need a sec." In terms of training with Apachai, concussions were commonplace, and he was fortunate that it hadn't been a headshot. The frightening thing was that Apachai was actually trying to be more relaxed with them. Appa. Mitts held high in triumph. Apachai cheered on the winded, near unconscious blonde for not giving up. Naruto didn. Tigo unconscious or die. Apachai is all fired up. However, it wasn't intended to be, as proud as we are of Naruto not dying. Apachai. Akisame intervened. I think we should trade in Kenichi now. The famous doctor could see that the blonde was just a hair's breadth away from fainting, so he would give him a reward for his perseverance and Apachai's constantly improving self-control. Regretfully, Kenichi was forced to accept the stick in that arrangement. At the sight, Kenichi let out a whimper. They lived up to that standard in Ryozanpaka, with death lurking in the background during every training session. Naruto hobbled past the trembling disciple to take his place on the sidelines, while he trudged on toward his possible demise. "Let's see," the Jujutsu master thought as he jabbed the blonde in the ribs despite his grimace. Naruto refrained from sucking wind at the pain. The retraining was going well. No broken ribs good. Although previously strong, the effects of the retraining were starting to manifest. Muscle groups were getting better. All they had to do now was cope with the more challenging ingrained lessons. In battle, Naruto had a propensity to act without thinking. It was instinctive. He was able to respond quickly to an attack. Unlike Kenichi, though the first disciple would probably soon acquire that skill, it tended to distinguish skilled fighters from novices. The issue was that he had not received any organized martial arts instruction prior to developing it. His instincts were all focused on the fighting skills of a brawler. To succeed and develop, he would need to relearn and modify this instinct to fit their teachings. Both teenagers collapsed on the ground just off the porch that surrounded the dojo following their joint session with Apachai. As evidence of their survival of the Tai Giant's lessons, each nurse had a variety of aches and bruises. While his blonde fellow disciple had his ice against his chest from where Apachai had almost broken his ribs, Kenichi had an epic ice pack with several bags strapped to his head by Mew. The blonde felt that way. At least he truly missed the times when he recovered almost instantly. Even though he wasn't as bad as most, he still recovered far more quickly than the average person. If it weren't for the mysteriously powerful mixtures Kensai and Akisame fed them to hasten their recuperations, he would have been in pain for several days. Combined with the fact that they had repeatedly refused to discuss it, he had the impression that it was best to keep it a secret. That's the tough love between master and student. In reaction to Kensai's taunting, Kenichi muttered, yeah, I can feel the love. Is it supposed to taste like the color purple? Purple? Really? Asked Naruto as he pressed himself against the porch and lay there. I could swear it tastes like umber, with a hint of sunshine. With his knees up to his chest and his eyes wide with admiration for the two disciples, Apachai was huddled on the walkway above them. Kenichi and Naruto can taste colors? Apachai is so jealous. Apachai tried tasting colors once, but the crayons tasted bad. The elder sat with Akisame, a shogi board between them, laughing heartily at Apachai's story and the moaning lumps of flesh that were Ryozanpaku's disciples. Ah. You boys should be more spirited. You're doing well, besides having no real aptitude between the two of you. Whoa, what a way to come up behind them and put the devil in their backs. Anyway, the sun's called it quits for the day. You two should clean up. Dinner should be ready soon. Naruto said, I know this is supposed to be for our betterment, elder. He pushed himself up, swaying to his feet, and grabbed Kenichi's arm to put it mildly, but you're all a bunch of mean people. Akisame casually replied, placing a stone on the board and grabbing the corner. Did anyone else hear? Please work me into the dirt early tomorrow morning, sensei. Kenichi enjoyed not being the center of attention because he lacked the strength to respond in any way and lacked Naruto's ability to mouth off. Since the disciples had moved into the dojo, dinner was pretty much the same as it had always been because the masters tended to snag bits from their plates. Both had to eat extremely defensively since Kenichi had been singled out as the easier target. Naruto had not yet had as much trouble with that. The two were escorted on their customary post-dinner jog shortly after. Naruto kept his tire loaded with strange statues and kept a long distance ahead to avoid getting whipped himself, while Kenichi brandished his tire and whip like a sensei. He ached, the stars were out, the night was fair, and a hot spring was calling to him. Even though this was probably his fourth or fifth springtime visit since arriving, he was still in awe of all the traps his weapons instructor frequently planted in the area. It didn't bother him because he knew how to avoid traps. It was simply something to be admired. He sighed and slipped into the steaming water. From the time he dropped in until he reached his waist, it required some self-control to keep his entire body from relaxing. Lowering himself to his neck, he took a decompressing breath. Heaven, he let the water do its magic while his eyelids drifted closed. Shoo! With a drowsy blink, he nearly met Tachimaru's gaze as the mouse waved at him nonchalantly. He let it go and closed his eyes again, yawning. Shouldn't sleep. In the spring, hold on a second, he was currently too anxious to open his eyes. Shigur-sensei? Yes. Why are you in the hot spring? Or, better yet, when? He had not felt the water move, nor had he heard her. Felt like it, He sat up, forced himself to ignore his sleepiness, and glanced in the general direction of her voice. Trying not to look, he was aware of his sensei's slight lack of modesty. Nevertheless, he hadn't anticipated this kind of result. Shigur was sitting hardly an arm's length away from him, her eyes half-lidded and almost drowsy, and she was utterly naked. When her hair was pinned up out of the way, she looked even more gorgeous. Returning to the dojo, Kensai lost his grip on his most recent magazine. He felt his arrow senses tingle. He was missing something. Arrow that was happening somewhere. The fact that the majority of her chest was covered in water made him very happy. That sort of embarrassment was not what he was anticipating. He was proud of his restraint. So don't stare. Tachimaru had swam over to him during that assessment and climbed up onto his shoulder, climbing all the way up his hair to the top of his head. He used his spiky hair as a board to perform a swan dive with such grace that it wasn't just for a mouse. Plop. He was at a loss for words in such a situation. I won't be teaching you tomorrow. She broke the ice, which was ideal. He would have more time to come up with a plan to wait. What? No practice? That was really unsettling so far. Shigur had never skipped a training session. He hadn't been here for very long, though he looked at his teacher with genuine interest, distracted enough to clear his mind of any possible embarrassment. Why not? I am going out. Oh no, concise as usual. He wasn't probing. Can I ask why? This was merely the emergence of idle curiosity. Yes, really. It's not that he shouldn't have anticipated this from a master who delighted in manipulating his followers' mortality. He said icily, "Where are you going, sensei?" Out, for his own honor. He also refrained from slapping himself for failing to anticipate that one. Out of the blue, she said, "Maybe I'll tell you," in a whispery voice, "when I get back." He sank to his nose in the water, where his grousing could only be heard as bubbles, and complained at his sensei's unusually cryptic speech. A soft, wet weight fell upon his head. His gaze flickered to Shigur, who had her arm extended and her hand resting on his head. He petted his hair and said, "Good boy." He wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a joke with her. He was completely taken aback by the slight, almost drowsy smile on her face as she looked down at him with what he could only assume was intense laughter. He made an effort not to blush in that sense. He failed, but he made an effort. He noticed Tachimaru on her head, looking at him with speculation while making a "I've got my eyes on you" motion with her tiny paws. It was funny, perplexing, and a little unsettling. In the end, he would have to wait for his weapons instructor to come back day and night. He waited for the food to be served at the dinner table, achingly collapsing after enduring the master's beatings and their alleged daily lessons. After school, in that sense, he was outperforming Kenichi. Both of them were capable of taking a beating, but even without his chakra, Naruto's amazing and welcome ability to recover was unmatched. Kenichi needed to be roused and reminded to eat because he was slipping in and out of consciousness. Halfway through, Shigur shuffled down the wooden walkway, silently but wearily, past the open doors. He had sensed her presence from the first step on the wooden planks, and the other masters probably knew as soon as she had stepped through the gate. God bless his ears. She also had a rough appearance. Tears and what appeared to be suspicious slash marks were all over the battered duster she'd left in, and it was barely holding together. Since the masters didn't give it much thought, he didn't bring it up, but he was curious to know the reason behind her worn condition. He was awestruck that someone could do that to her and respected her skill. However, he saw the long, wrapped package in her hand before she cleared the doors. Only an educated idiot could reach a likely conclusion, but it would take an idiot to not reach one. A blade? She still had hers on her back. What was this, then? He ate slowly, enjoying his food. Miu was a really good cook, and a satisfying meal was like sweet relief after the days they usually spent at the dojo. He set down his utensils and the kunai he had been using covertly to repel the masters, his plate appearing as clean as if it had been cleaned. He was apparently in time as well, because Tachimaru was sitting on his shoulder when he felt a tug on his hair. Shoo. He knew pretty well what the little fellow desired. He said, I'm gonna take a plate to Shigur-sensei, and picked up the plate she had already made. Get going then, son, the elder said, sipping his tea and unwinding. I'm certain she'd hungry after a long day. Nevertheless, Naruto departed as quickly as he could, fully aware that the Kenpo master would make some derogatory comments if he didn't. Unfortunately, He didn't see the little man get up and run for the door before the elder caught his tunic tail as though he was unsure of the man's precise destination. He said, "Kensai, please, you're interrupting dinner." Given how little Tachimaru had been sent to retrieve their second disciple, the wise man surmised that there was a reason for privacy, even though he usually let the man play around. The elder was proud of how their disciples had brought life to the dojo, only their small family, and because of all their eccentricities, things had been falling apart. Kenichi first, followed by Naruto. They had all been sobered by the two. Perhaps that word was a little too strong. They had provided them with something to concentrate on. Yes, that accurately reflected how their lives had changed. Mew grinned more, which made his old, youthful heart sing. Shiger was undoubtedly being altered by Naruto. He had always suspected that she would make an excellent teacher. She gave training young Naruto her all, and it turned out to be true. When Naruto accepted her training, the depression she had displayed at Kenichi's distaste for weapons vanished entirely. Jiraiya's description of Naruto was very similar. Despite his lack of intelligence and stubbornness, he absorbed proper instruction like a sponge, a good student. Possibly even better, if the instructor was prepared to smooth out all of his flaws, which there were plenty of. The parallels between him and Jiraiya were amusing, but they were also uplifting. It was rare to find men like that. Not that he didn't have aspirations for Ken-chan as well. Their family has such promising new children.
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.